begin with one particular story about little Bobby, who had his first year of kindergarten, and it wasn't going all that well. It came winter time, and he had an opportunity to go spend some time with Grandma. And so Grandma kind of sensed that Bobby was a little bit, upset, maybe a little bit tight, a little bit disturbed, and so she decided to take Bobby on a walk. It had snowed the night before, and it was beautiful outside, and she took him on a walk through the park to see everything. And as they're walking through the park, she remarked, "Doesn't it look like an artist painted this scenery? In fact, did you know that God painted this just for you?" And little Bobby just kind of looked at Grandma and said, "Well, yes, God did it, and he did it left-handed." Now, Grandma was a little puzzled by that remark. Left-handed. Where's this from? So she said, "What makes you say God did this with his left hand?" And Bobby said, "Well, we learned at Sunday school last week that Jesus sits on God's right hand." We begin this story focused on the stories that we tell for this season. And just like in that story of little Bobby, sometimes we take those stories and we hear what we want to hear, don't we? We kind of take them. In fact, we've taken this wonderful story about the Savior coming into the world, and in many ways, we've romanticized it for our comfort. I noticed right away when I began to read the gospel stories closely and look at the Christmas story in particular, that, those Christmas plays that we put on Sundays, and all the grandparents and all the parents come and everybody's here. And we've actually taken two stories and melded them into one. And they look so nice and sweet. But if you really stop and think about the original story, was it like that? The truth is, it was probably more difficult than we give Mary and Joseph credit for. If you think about Mary coming to her parents and telling them, "Here I am, a young child, and I'm going to bear a child," and it's happened by a miracle, their minds were probably not really filled with sweet thoughts of a birth that would be memorialized by people with little scenes that they put on tables all over their homes for 2,000 years. In fact, if anything, Mary's mother was probably watching out the window or the door or whatever the opening was in the house to make sure that there wasn't a crowd approaching the house coming to gather her lovely young daughter and take her into the streets and stone her to death. Now that's not so romantic, is it? And imagine what Joseph felt like sitting on the other side of town, trying to figure out what his next move should be. His promised bride was pregnant, and it wasn't his doing. And he probably had that one close friend who he had sat down with and said, "I just don't know where to go, what to do, how to handle this." And the friend said, "Well, just, move on, get rid of her, drop her. There's plenty of women. There's plenty of fish in the sea, right?" And yet he had this complicated angelic visit that informed him of his role in this great plan that was complicating his life as much as it was complicating Mary's life. So when you think about the story in those terms, it's a little bit different, isn't it? It's probably been really only about the last 400 years that people began to argue over the believability of this epic story that we share this time of the year. And what most people have failed to understand is, if you go and read Matthew's version of this story, I bet 98%, probably even 99.9% of you skip Matthew's listing of all the names, right? Primarily because you can't pronounce most of them. And as a preacher, I've told people if you can't pronounce it, it probably doesn't matter that much. But in this story, it does. You see, that story gives credence to the rest of the story. And Matthew begins the story that had been passed on orally from one group to the next group to the next group, until Matthew decided somebody ought to put this down. And what stood out for Matthew when he's recording this story is where it says, this is the genealogy of Jesus the Christ. Genealogy, that's a word we're familiar with. But did you know that it's tied to the root of another word we're familiar with? Genesis. Same root word. Genesis means the beginning. And what this story is now is the beginning of another section of the story. It's a new beginning, in fact, for this story is not finished yet. It's the story of God entering the world, and he didn't do it in a fancy way. If you think about this arrival, it stirs up memories of our own entry into the world. We all kind of came in innocent with those great hopes and promises in the minds and hearts of our parents. There was a lot of excitement among our families, probably in particular, and maybe even among our church family. We all have an individual story that's different from the one that we read in the scriptures, but it's a story that's similar in that it was filled with hope. Hope for how this child might impact the world. Bottom line, our parents had a certain amount of hope for each of us. And because of the world that we live in, our hope is usually focused on success and happiness. And it depends on how we define that word success and happiness as to whether or not we're fulfilling that hope. Paul, on the other hand, was rather clear in how he defined success for the people in a tiny church in the town of Thessalonica. For him, success was understanding that Jesus loved them and Jesus was going to return soon to take them with him. If you read the bulk of this letter that we have, 1 Thessalonians, you'll understand, you'll begin to understand that Paul was talking about a very small church that wasn't completely mature when Paul was forced to leave them. You go back to the Acts, you can read a little bit about the church and the people of Thessalonica. And at that time, Paul would go in and begin to teach, and he would begin to develop relationships, and they would set up a church. And then along would come some people who didn't like what he was doing. I know that's hard to imagine. And they would run him out of town. And so he was writing back because he really had this longing within his heart to go back and see them again and to fill in the gaps in their faith. He knew they were experiencing some trials, and they probably were under persecution by the Roman government at that point in time. And they weren't a church like we think of church. I mean, they had no wonderful, beautiful building that was nice and warm and comfortable and where they felt safe to go and gather and worship. They probably didn't have an experienced leader to guide them. There was probably somebody that stepped out that was able to share the stories and the letters that Paul wrote. And so somebody was their leader, but, not a lot of experience, didn't have a fantastic understanding of what he was talking about, probably a little bit like me, and no overflow of Bibles and hymnals to read from and to fulfill their faith and those statements that we read. They didn't have all of that. They were just a group of people who gathered together on a regular basis and worshiped God and told and heard the stories of Jesus Christ that they had been communicated to from Paul. And in their time, in their day, their most important part of that story was that, look at all of the bad things that are happening to you because of this faith, and yet don't worry about it. Because Jesus is coming back pretty soon. And when he does, it's going to be okay. It's going to be all right. Their faith was based on this hope of the return of Jesus Christ. And Paul was writing from a similar mindset, a mindset that we've been less enthusiastic about in recent years. I mean, he was a part of a group of believers that looked forward to the return of Christ. And we're talking about it, and they expected it to take place as a physical reality and happen soon. I don't think we probably live with that same expectation today. I mean, I'm not saying that people don't believe that Jesus is coming back. I think there's a lot of people that believe Jesus is coming back. Our biggest concern at this point in time is that he doesn't come back before our loved ones know that and are connected with him. Because we don't want anybody to be left out. Nor does God. But for the most part, we aren't sure about what's happening. I mean, generation after generation has passed and come and gone. We've heard these stories. Been, 2,000 years now. People have been saying, Jesus is coming back. It's going to happen soon. And here we are. When the disciples asked Jesus when that event would take place, he told them that it would happen like a thief in the night. Well, we know what to do with the thief in the night today, don't we? We have people who have figured out how to take care of our homes and set it up so that if a thief enters our home at night, we're going to know it, and so is everyone else in the neighborhood and probably the police. Wonderful technology, wonderful inventions for the world, but there still isn't anybody out there that I know of who has an invention that will tell us when Jesus is coming in the night. And the point of the story that Jesus was sharing was that if you knew, you'd put it on your day planner. You'd write it in your phone. You'd take care of making sure that that was the day. And when 2 days are about left, you say, oh, I got 2 days. I better do something about that. But the point Jesus was trying to make is you should do something about that every day. Meanwhile, we go on living in this crazy, mixed-up world. Facing our own kind of persecution in some respects. Difficult to share with other people this story, but we celebrate the seasons in the church because they remind us that we still have that same hope. We still have that hope. And the hope comes from a child who was born this time of the year, and he told us that we have to do a couple of things while we're waiting for that day to come. Love God, love one another. And I wanted to share some stories, some traditional stories, some of those legends that we have at Christmas that we would talk about throughout this series. And so all of them are going to be focused on that particular point, that we love one another. And these stories, I believe, model that kind of love. And the first story that we have, it comes to us about the stork. I mean, when you have this, you think of the image of a stork, that's the image you have, probably. And there's a reason that you have that image. And it comes from this legend that the stork, this long-legged, long-beaked bird, was somewhere near when this event happened, when the Christ child was born, that this bird was standing there among the other animals. And as this compassionate creature was looking down upon this king, she noticed that he was lying in a device that was created to hold food for animals. It wasn't your average Tempur-Pedic. It was a solid piece of wood. And so the story tells us that as this compassionate creature looked upon the king and decided that's not going to do, and began to use her beak to pluck feathers out of her breast and create a soft pillow to put under the head of the Christ child. And because of this act, on the behalf of this creature, the child blessed the bird to be the patron of all babies, which has given us this image. Not so much to deliver children as perhaps to be the patron saint, to make sure they come into the world with the same hope that this child brought to them. It's a story of love.